Right, so whether you loathe him or hate him, Keir Starmer's loyalties and deference to Israel is, I'm sure all can agree, pretty unquestionable. And the same can be said of much of his rancid government, his front bench especially. And nothing quite nails that on. Nothing quite nails that on. Like so many of them attending en masse, all together, including Starmer himself, who wouldn't miss this gig for the world. He probably can't afford to if that pro-Israel money is going to keep rolling in to prop him up. Attending the annual Labour Friends of Israel lunch, which took place just yesterday. So many government figures falling over themselves to show how loyal they are to Israel, in spite of the genocide they've been meting out in Gaza for more than 420 days, and the ongoing continued strikes in Lebanon and beyond, all despite a ceasefire being in place there, Israel having now violated that ceasefire more than 100 times, as is being reported as of this morning. There is no shaking this government's loyalty to Israel, and we can't ever let them forget it, that we know it. The trouble is, if we don't know this is what they're up to, however, if our media aren't going to report on it, and they aren't, how can we do so? Because these people will never not side with Israel. And the longer the genocide goes on, the more appalled we are by it, and therefore the mainstream media ignoring it completely, not one of them reporting on this, is itself a political choice and a pro-government bias. Because they're covering up an action they know is impossible to defend, and yet again it's independent media and social media where you'll need to go to hear all about this. So how about we start with a bit of Starmer's speech there, because of course he gave one of those too, didn't he?
The policy of this government towards ceasefire has not changed. There is no ceasefire worthy of the name which does not, as item number one, include the return of all the hostages. And that is what we're working for day and night. But I also want, in the spirit of that touching speech, as we did at the event marking 1 year since October the 7th, to read the words of the Acheinu Prayer. Have mercy on them and bring them from distress to comfort, from darkness to light, from slavery to redemption, now, swiftly, and soon.
Right, so that was a small snippet of Keir Starmer's speech to Labour Friends of Israel. I'm not going to inflict too much of it on you. I want to keep you awake after all. Talking about the return of hostages as item number one in any ceasefire worthy of the name, before invoking the words of the Acheinu Prayer, a prayer for captives as that is. But the context of invoking that implies that only one set of hostages here actually matters, that he is only considering one set of hostages, those taken by Hamas on October 7th. Never mind the Palestinian hostages, many times more of them held by Israel in detention without charge, many more of them taken since October 7th as well, not just from Gaza but from the West Bank too. No mention of them. They don't matter. They don't seem to count. 2 days ago, a 12-year-old boy was sentenced to a year in prison by Israel, tried as an adult for having thrown stones. Yet a grown Israeli man can empty his clip into a child of the same age and get found not guilty of murder. There is no such thing as justice for Palestinians in Israel, and Starmer and his ilk would oppress the oppressed even more, stand against a ceasefire with the oppressors and say prayers for them, demand the release of their people, but has nothing to say for Palestine. Nothing nails that on more than the mere existence in this day and age of bodies like Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel. Starmer, of course, was not alone in attending this event, far from it, this lunch, because with him in attendance were David Lammy, Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden, Wes Streeting, Lucy Powell, Steve Reed, Lisa Nandy, Ellie Reeves, Jonathan Reynolds, Peter Kyle, and plenty of Labour backbenchers besides. Roughly a quarter of Labour Party MPs, about 100 of them, were apparently there, along with other dreadful former Labour MPs like Margaret Hodge, Louise Ellman and Ruth Smeeth. A who's who of the ghastliest, nastiest elements of the Zionist Labour Party. Also in attendance was the UK ambassador for Israel, Zippy Hotovely, a woman who should have been expelled from the country and packed off back to Israel given her previous words.
Two-state solution? Is there still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new one...
Does that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is, what type of Palestinians are on the other side? This is what Israel realized on the 7th of October. The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then
because
how can there be peace? How can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
without offering a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead.
Why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created these radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
Okay, Zippy, why indeed are we obsessed with that idea of a two-state solution then, when Israel has never been an honest broker in such an idea to begin with, and given this is very much a Western-backed ideal, which Western leaders keep on saying is contingent on a peace with Israel and a secure and safe Israeli state first and foremost, that two-state solution, therefore, has always been conditional on putting Israel first. But here you heard it from that clip of Hotovelli from last year, where Hotovelli dismissed the idea of a two-state solution as an obsession. Clearly, therefore, there can only be a one-state solution then. It had better be the one with the legal right to exist, in which case, and not the one created out of British settler colonialism. This is also why those backing Israel keep insisting publicly that Israel has a right to exist. But if you have to keep saying it, then, well, you might have a problem proving it true, in which case. No country, fundamentally, has a right to exist. It's nonsense. What has a right to exist is people. People have a right to exist. Palestinians have a right to exist. But to a Zionist, well, that's probably an anti-Semitic thing to say, isn't it, really? Well, balls to them. Now, I'm as guilty as anyone else for backing a two-state solution, two peoples living in peace side by side, but both have to be willing participants in that for it to be possible, and the Zionist apartheid state of Israel is not if their ambassador can openly speak such language on national mainstream TV. They want it all, and we're seeing that with crazy settlers like Daniela Weiss having been allowed into Gaza to basically start measuring up the curtains, and the hope that when Donald Trump becomes president, he will back the annexation of the whole West Bank, such has been the view extolled by hard-right Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich in recent days. But back to this LFI luncheon. Stepping away from the attitudes of those behind it, you will, of course, if not for social media, not know a thing about this event even having happened. It hasn't been widely advertised, and the media have ignored it because there is no positive spin that can possibly be put on it for Team Keith. Labour lost seats it should have won at the general election, lost ground. Majorities have become marginals because of Starmer's unapologetic pro-Israel attitude going into that election. His continued unquestioning support for Israel since has certainly in part seen his polling further slide, his dishonesty about everything he said he stood for likely doing more damage ultimately. But Israel will have played its part in that story as well. And so by ignoring this story here and now, the mainstream media are covering for Starmer. Whether they are centrist or right-wing rags, all have their pro-Israel proclivities, so all have let this story slide. The only rag to cover it is the one that pretty much had to, really, that being Jewish news, though it should more honestly be called Zionist news, because plenty of Jewish people are appalled by this rag, and the cringe coverage by their chief scribbler Lee Harpin on this event set the tone for the agenda that was behind the dinner, as this excerpt explains. Delivering the keynote speech at Monday's event, the Prime Minister was forced to respond to a damning attack on the UK's position at the United Nations made in a speech by the mother of British hostage Emily Damari. Speaking to 550 guests, including the PM, cabinet ministers and communal leaders, Mandy Damari said the UK government's vote for an unconditional ceasefire at the United Nations would leave Emily and the other hostages in the hands of Hamas. To loud applause, Emily's mother added, "That vote shocked me and it broke my heart." Now, as a parent, I sympathise with her position, but it's been politicised too, and she's been part of it here. Starmer's speech, the excerpt I showed at the start, was actually in response to Mandy Damari's demand. It gave Starmer the opportunity to refute the UN Security Council vote, backed by the UK, who voted in favour of a ceasefire, instead of abstaining finally, as they had done all along up until now, but which got vetoed anyway ultimately by the US, as they always do. So actually her complaint was largely meaningless, because no action was taken, despite the way the UK voted. A ceasefire will see hostages returned. That's been part of the deal. It has been part of every single deal that has been agreed to by Hamas that has been scuppered by Netanyahu. The reason they were taken to begin with is to bargain for Palestinian captives to be released in exchange. It's happened many times over the years. Only this time did Netanyahu decide to use it as cover for a genocide. And yet 500 people, some 100 of them at least Labour MPs, got lobbied here in effect to not back a ceasefire until the hostages are released. I can't fathom the logic. It makes no sense to me to not work for peace and see your people, Damari's daughter, returned. The biggest obstacle to all of this has always been Netanyahu, not Hamas. He doesn't want peace. He can't afford peace if he wants to stay in his job and keep trying to dodge those corruption charges. And what we've seen at this lunch is lobbying of the government by the people who pull their strings and finance their campaigns to stick with the plan and stick with Israel, regardless of what they do. LFI should be a prescribed group by the Labour Party. Israel are guilty of terrorism, yet instead they get elevated and lauded, and those in attendance shouldn't be anywhere near the reins of power. Sticking by Israel goes against the views of an increasing majority of people in this country, goes against common decency and international law. I'm reminded of rhetoric of taking our country back. Seems to take on new meaning when our politicians are seen here falling over themselves so much for another nation, and one acting as Israel is at that. But again, you won't know anything about it unless you're looking at the right sources. While Starmer and co fall over themselves in their support for Israel, though, Israel have been caught out apparently using a weapon so bizarre and the effects on the human body so horrifying that it sounds like something out of a work of science fiction. But it's scarily science fact. Get the details of this new attack by Israel and Gaza in this video recommendation here, as you suggested next watch. Please do support the channel by liking, sharing and subscribing if you have not done so already. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.